So after 75 years of war, occupation and political interference, installing dictators, undermining local political movements, torturing enemies and assisting in the arrest of opposition leaders, the US military-industrial complex doesn't seem to know how to stop. So with this, I'd like to introduce The American Way, Comma's most ambitious anthology yet, featuring short stories inspired by US foreign policy from 1945 to the present day. And this evening's talk, The American Way, When the Good Guys Are the Bad Guys, will involve a conversation between myself, Ra, Bret, and a pre-recorded conversation between Ra and Chilean author Lina Meruane. And then later, Bret will discuss Kim Thuy's piece on Vietnam. So Ra, if you don't mind introducing yourself first, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm Rob Page. I'm one of the two co-editors of this book, The American Way. I'm going to be talking a little bit about it on the video and the interview with Lina. But essentially, this book came about through a meeting between myself and the other co-editor, Ursula Casagrande. Ursula is a journalist, a filmmaker, a translator, and an assistant on peace negotiations. She lived in Northern Ireland in Belfast and was part of the Good Friday peace negotiations. She's also lived in Havana and has been part of the FARC Colombian peace negotiations. She is an artistic curator who's worked with Kurdish artists and writers. And she is originally from Venice and has lived in Barcelona and Havana. So she's incredibly well connected. And this book was really brought about by her amazing connections. So that's all I'll say for now.
Great. And Bret, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then we'll watch the pre-recorded video.
Excellent. Yeah, so I was so glad to take part in this project. I'm a literary translator from the French and Spanish, working in New York City.
Great. So yeah, we've got a video now, which we'll play.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in this next section of tonight's event. As you know, my name is Rob Page. I'm the founder of Common Press, and tonight, for this part of the event, we're going to be talking about The American Way, Stories of Invasion, which is a rather large anthology myself and Ursula Casagrande edited and brought out a few months ago. The idea with this anthology was to fit in with a series of commissions where Comma uses the short story and the ability of the short story to take sort of deep dives into new material, into research, areas of research, or whether that's scientific research or historical research, and to allow authors to collaborate with experts or to respond to research or to respond to historical moments. And each story in these anthologies is accompanied by a short afterward by a historian or an expert. So you get a kind of a hybrid, a mix of fiction based on reality and also non-fiction, kind of exegesis, non-fiction or explanation or contextualization of what the story is about. In this case, it's part of a series called History into Fiction, and the series has previously included studies of or explorations of British protest history written by fiction writers in collaboration with or in partnership with historians. With this particular book, we wanted to explore the long history of American interventionism, American US foreign policy, and intervention on foreign soil from 1945 onwards, really starting with the 1953 Iran coup, which was a CIA-led coup, and then covering all forms of intervention from election interference, CIA-funded coups, stay-behind networks, all the way up to torture programs and full-blown invasions. It's a huge, epic history, and America's interventions cover. There's something like over 80 examples of American intervention in the 20th century and the early 21st century, and sometimes it's referred to as the Long War or since sort of 9/11, it's sometimes referred to as the Forever War. And the book came out just as it was just coming out as President Biden was following up on his commitment to withdraw from Afghanistan. And it seemed like this might be a turning point in US foreign policy, but it also seemed for us to be a good time to remind ourselves of the much longer, much wider history, and the fact that a huge military budget has just been pushed through Congress, and larger than any previous military budget, and that this money and this infrastructure doesn't go away. So we wanted to explore it, and we also wanted to explore it from a subjective point of view and a point of view of the countries being invaded. We looked at obviously well-known examples of American intervention in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, through to less well-known stay-behind networks and foreign interference. And we were exploring this idea of situated knowledge, this idea of telling these histories from the points of views of the countries that had been invaded or intervened in, rather than just following the narrative which centralizes the US point of view in every kind of telling of this story. And obviously a key moment in this wider history is the 1973 coup that removed and assassinated Salvador Allende in Chile. And we're very, very lucky to have a fantastic Chilean author contribute to this book and with us tonight. Lina Meruane is an award-winning Chilean writer and scholar. She's published 2 collections of short stories and 5 novels, 2 of which have been translated into English by Megan McDowell, Seeing Red and Nervous System, which were both published by Atlantic. And she has also written several non-fiction books, among which was her essay on the impact and representation of the AIDS epidemic in Latin American literature, Viral Voyages. She is also currently a teacher of global cultures and creative writing in New York University in Madrid. Lina, thank you very much for joining us. Before you read from your story, which is called Plan Z or Plan Zeta, could you tell us a little bit about the history of this particular narrative, Plan Z?
Yes. Thank you very much, Ra, for the introduction, and especially for inviting me to write a story for this book, which I think is a sort of important book because there's so much about Latin America that people wouldn't know, and sort of the very intense, long intervention from the United States in the continent. This is, of course, all happening during the Cold War. The Red Scare of the Cuban Revolution really changed the American tactic and the relationship between the United States and Latin America, which made any single socialist government or candidate hugely feared, right? And the United States really felt that they had to protect their patio, their backyard. So this is what really led in 1973 to a coup in Chile. Actually, there were one was a sort of a failed coup, a failed intervention, and then actually a coup a little bit later that same year in September 11 of 1973. And what is very terrible about this story is that actually the president, Salvador Allende, was a democratically elected president who was really sort of forbidden to be the president of the country because the intervention first was economic. There was a lot of funding happening so that sort of the economy would fail. Actually, Nixon claimed that he would make the economy what was the word? The economy scream, that was the word. So first they tried via the economy, because of course it wasn't well received, the fact that there was an intervention on a democratically elected president. But when that failed, then they actually supported the coup. And so this story is the story of a mother and a daughter many years later, actually sort of more in the present, discussing that event and how that happened. And sort of, I wanted to relate to the fact that Chile for a very long time was a country divided in two, an upper class and also lower classes that supported the coup because they felt that the Allende's government was failing. Of course it was failing because it was intervened. And later generations, people who have actually rethought what happened and figured out that this actually was being done to Chile, right? And so it's the mother who supported the coup and the daughter who is a historian who actually has done the research and is trying to convince her mother somehow that there was intervention, that this wasn't a good thing that happened in Chile. And so I'm going to be reading only two short fragments. It's the mother who supported the coup and the daughter who is a historian who actually has done the research and is trying to convince her mother somehow that there was intervention, that this wasn't a good thing that happened in Chile. And so I'm going to be reading only two short fragments of the story. So let me start with the first one. They're both short. Fortunately, the military listened to us, the mother, her slackened face with too much flesh, and thank God they did. She raised her voice in English, then returned to the comfort of Spanish more soberly. The gringos understood how serious the matter was, and together we defended ourselves against the Marxists. The daughter noticed the strange appearance of the word Marxist in the mother's wrinkled mouth, and she wondered if for once she was trying to be more measured or at least more exact. She had always called them upelientos, and the daughter discovered in that instant that she preferred upeliento, much as it was an insulting and degrading word, much as it combined the initials of the Popular Unity Party with peliento, shaggy, tattered, miserable. And she preferred the contemptuous word. The daughter did, because it declared upfront and undisguised the mother's hatred for all those men, and especially the women, who had voted for the government of Salvador Allende. All those rattle-boned layabout women seduced by socialism, convinced that I don't know what white knight was going to pull them out of poverty and stick them in a palace while the whole country went to hell, she had said on certain occasions. Or else, she said more quietly, they were going to take away everything we had earned through hard work and give it to the rabble who only knew how to hold out their hands. She'd sit waiting for a reaction from the daughter, who would produce a tense-lipped smile or grab her book-heavy backpack and get into the car and head down from the hilltop neighborhood of fenced-in guarded condominiums to her apartment in the crowded center of Santiago, ironically whistling Las casitas del barrio alto, con rejas y antejardín, that song by the murdered Victor Jara, or singing the little boxes of the original English. That used to be what she did, make her exit humming without even saying goodbye. She'd done it often while her father was still alive, if the father's day-to-day could be called life, incapacitated for years, confined to a wheelchair, unable to move even his lips. She could depart and leave the mother talking to her Aurelio, venting onto a husband who could no longer contradict her, but neither could he agree. Back then, she wouldn't be left alone, the mother, with the door slam echoing in her eardrums. But now that the father was dead, those enraged exits could only accentuate the mother's solitude. Because though she was accompanied day and night, 7 days a week and 12 months of the year, lifelong, by Rosa, she now felt that she had no one to talk to. Then a little bit later, there's this monologue of the daughter trying to convince the mother of her wrong interpretation of what happened in Chile. The mother remembered that monologue, remembered having felt momentarily proud of her daughter, who must be a great history teacher. It was clear she had studied conscientiously, that she had learned a few things, even if she hadn't lived through those events she was talking about. If only she wasn't so vehement and sententious. If only there weren't such rage in her words. And she imagined that the biggest troublemakers among the students would interpret that rage as passion and social commitment and would admire her daughter. The mother leaned her head back to get some air. She was so aggressive, the daughter, and that's why she was alone and bitter like an arugula leaf. And since when did she hate the United States so much? An enormously rich and organized country full of hard-working people who pulled themselves up by the bootstraps without complaining and ended up becoming millionaires. And those opulent cities with beaches of turquoise waters and outlet stores full of elegant Cubans nostalgic for the island that had expelled them. How the mother missed Miami. Since Aurelio's accident, she hadn't had anyone to go with, and she wasn't about to invite her daughter, definitely not her daughter, because even if she accepted, which was unlikely, she would make life impossible with her endless disquisition about Cuba. She saw the daughter's pedagogical hand rise up in her memory, her right hand, her long ringless fingers that bent into a fist as she enumerated each and every one of the imperialist interventions on the continent. Pinky finger, the annexation of half of Mexican territory. Ring finger, the anti-Sandinista operation. Middle finger, Guatemalan genocide. Index finger, Cuba and the embargo, and the failed Bay of Pigs, followed by the missile crises and that almost blew the planet up. The mother couldn't help but stare at her daughter's rough, calloused elbow. She'd have to suggest a little lotion, or her skin would end up cracked and bleeding by the daughter. But the daughter was accusing the gringos of pushing the Cubans to align with the Soviets when they tried to put the squeeze on them. They took it upon themselves to turn a leftist revolution into a communist dictatorship. Understand?
Love and
She was tiresome, her daughter, giving lectures. The mother had dared to ask where she got all that stuff. But what do you mean, where? Sputtered the daughter. I've spent years researching the Cold War on our continent.
So Love and Remains, it was another wonderful contribution to this collection from Kim Thuy, the pretty well-known Canadian Vietnamese writer, primarily a novelist. Her novels are regularly translated into English. And so this is from the section of the book dealing with the Vietnam War, so from 1955 to 1975. And it's a refugee story, so it's a war story. And as Ra and Meruane may discuss, Lina may discuss a little later, you know, American intervention is so often a prelude to a kind of launch into diaspora and the creation of diasporic peoples. And Thuy's own history is one of the, as a refugee, as one of the Vietnamese boat people. The story Love and Remains is a story about a young woman named Ha, who's navigating life in Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. I'm going to read a section from what could be considered sort of like a pedagogical interlude in the middle of the story. It is a history lesson in a way, and a reminder of the lasting, of the remaining, if you will, thinking of the title Love and Remains, horrors of the US bombing and herbicidal campaigns that were conducted in Vietnam, and how they continue to ravage Vietnamese lives today. Yes, so from Love and Remains, which is, it's also a story of the enduring power of love. You have to read the rest of the story to see how that theme unfolds. So a short section from this middle section of Thuy's work. Today, even 45 years after the war, millions of bombs, mines, grenades, shells, mortars, and other unexploded ordnance still lurk in the rice paddies, in backyards, under the feet of school children. Every time a farmer's scream is blotted out by the detonation of a bomb beat, every time an explosion forever erases a child's vision of the blue sky, the United States is heard from again. According to some, it will take 300 years before demining operations clear the last bomb. In a different way, Operation Ranch Hand, the aerial spraying of herbicides during the war, has also left its mark on Vietnam, both geographically and genetically. The so-called rainbow herbicides killed the trees, dried up the land, and blighted humans across generations. The Vietnamese who didn't succumb to cancer gave birth to children who resemble casualties of war. Kids with heads too heavy to hold up, babies with eyes turned inwards so as not to witness atrocities, babies born with holes in their hearts. The chemical legacy of 20 years of American occupation of the country is spread over 20,000 square kilometers of land and runs through the veins of more than 3 million people. Had the newly victorious communist government known in 1975 that their enemies would never withdraw from the nation's soil, collective memory, or rhythms of everyday life, perhaps they would not have ordered the re-education camp directors to be so unflinching in rooting out ideas, silencing opposing views, and emptying the prisoners' heads of thoughts. That's a short section from Thuy's story.
Thank you for that. Before I ask you a question about the process of translating, we'll just return to the pre-record where Ra has a Q&A with Lina.
I can't hear you, Ra.
He talks about the way in which language is corrupted, and it's not the lack of evidence or the lack of truth that results in these stories not being told. It's just it's a kind of culture of mendacity and a culture of deceit and lying. And he says in one essay, it never happened. Sorry, I'm gonna start that again. He says it never happened. Sorry, I'm gonna just quote that again, and we'll cut this bit out. He says it never happened. Nothing ever happened, even while it was happening. It wasn't happening. There is a sense that there is a complete blindness, really, to this history, and the fact that we don't tell this history, and it's forgotten about, and because it's inconvenient, or it doesn't support the central narratives of our media. And you yourself have talked about how, as a teacher of global kind of history, global cultures, you've found you've been surprised by how little even your students know about their own history. How do you think the American administration, the US administration, has been able to get away with this history not being told?
Well, as you were saying, Rob, there is no lack of evidence. It's everywhere. And now that we have social media and so much out on internet, we know that the evidence is there. But it's not only about who in the past wrote the stories; it's about who controls the story, right? Not only sort of like who tells the story, but who actually remains in control of stories. And I think that the United States has been really sagacious in convincing, especially the ruling classes throughout Latin America, and I would say the third world, if we can call it that, that socialism is not good for them, that communism is hell, that people who oppose and protest are terrorists, right? And once you establish those false truths, what you have is people actually repeating over and over again and actually using that narrative. So it's not only the United States, and this is something that I really talk about in my own short story, how the mother feels a part of that, of making that history happen, right? In alliance with the desires of the United States. And once you have sort of a part of the local community convinced and wanting to participate in that narrative, it becomes harder and harder to undo it. And it seems like the other narrative is weak, unconvincing, not possible, etc. And so sort of that sort of alliance, I think, has an alliance also coming from power, because people in power also have their own interests in the United States as such a powerful country. So there is the economy at work, sort of the politics at work, the desire to make good with the United States, and also socially the desire to control sort of large portions of the population who could be against this sort of intervention. And I think that sort of mix is awful and has really made us blind to history. I was telling you the other day that I was surprised to see that a Panamanian student, while watching a documentary that we showed called the Panama Deception, about the US intervention in the 80s in Panama, which had made her mother go into exile to the United States, had no clue why they actually lived there. And she told me she had ran down the stairs and told her mother, "Mom, this happened in Panama." And the mother said, "Yes, why didn't you tell me?" And the mother was completely conflicted. So this is what education also does. It sort of tries to uncover historical events and the reasons and the occurrences and the alliances of the locals with the most powerful.
And from a completely sort of an outsider point of view, how do you suggest we go about picking through these different versions of history? You know, there's the question of, you know, what do we know is true when there are so many counter narratives and there's so many because of the internet and other things. The world is full of conspiracy theories, and some of which are weaponized and used by political forces, and some of which are not. You know, there are so many. Talking of situated knowledge, there's so many different sort of vested interests in different versions of these histories. What is your kind of your tool for picking through these? How do we know what to believe in this kind of conflict?
It's a terribly difficult question, of course. I think we once thought at the beginning of the World Wide Web that sort of information would be democratized, and that would allow us for sort of good information, trustworthy information, more participation of the audiences into their own lives and their own politics. But what we have discovered is that these are also ways of distributing misinformation and false truth, as we would call them. And so I, as an also scholar and as a reader and as a teacher, continually tell my students that, you know, you can use Wikipedia as an encyclopedia, but there's somebody who wrote that, and that information needs to be contrasted, and that sort of resorting to people who have done the serious research is always a must. Not that one scholar will tell all the truth, but I think that the more and more you read and study, you do find coincidences and stories done or put together by serious historians or serious critics about a specific subject. So I am very adamant in sort of using the work of serious researchers, hoping that they won't disappear, because also the university has become a really contested site. I think that that's what you've done with your book, Ra. I mean, the fact that I had the chance to talk to a historian, I eventually didn't need to do that because I had done my own research, and I am already a scholar who teaches these things. But I think that sort of putting that together and having somebody comment after the text gives us a sense of, like, where does at least fiction, which is supposed to be false, although it's many times truer than what is in the actual outlets of information, so that this fictional stories can sort of enter in a dialogue with scholars.
And is there a sense sometimes of looking for the power structures, like who is telling the story, and
absolutely,
violence has been applied, and are there other sort of clues to pick, you know, the false narratives and the false truths from the power?
Well, I really love what Melanie Klein always says. It's like, follow the money. So when you follow the money, you follow interests, right? And it gives you a clue of who is interested in gaining from a story. Usually the bad guys are interested in the money, and it's a really sort of obvious way of finding where the lies are. Of course, everybody in a story has interests, right? Everybody wants to have their truth told. And what is also very interesting is that also dictators want their own version of the truth told. It's not only that people who were the victims want their truths to be out. Also, the dictators want, or the authoritarian regimes want their truths to be out, and their justifications to be out. So that's also a super interesting thing. But I think that when we follow like personalized interests, economic interests, and the interest of the most powerful, you kind of figure out that oppression is coming from somewhere, and usually is from the top down.
You translated 2 stories in the American way. I wanted to ask you why it's important, you think, to hear these stories from the countries involved, and in non-English languages. And do you reckon the language barriers are one of the reasons that these stories aren't that well known in the English-speaking West? So I guess I'll put to you, how important are translators in projects like these?
Thank you, Nia, for that question. I mean, as I said earlier, I was so glad to be a part of this project, although glad isn't really, I think, the appropriate word, but from the outset, when Ra reached out to me to see if I could translate Fiston Mwanza Mujila's contribution, it felt immediately like a very substantial project. And first, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the first of Pama's history into fiction anthologies to leave the perimeter of the UK. So the stories that I had to translate were from Vietnam and the Congo, and there are certainly stories of intervention and invasion, as the subtitle of The American Way is Stories of Invasion. But they also, as I realized as I began translating them and working with them and living with the stories over a period of weeks, I realized that these were stories of aftermath as well. That is to say, and this gets to your question about the stories that we remember, the stories we tell. But what I mean by aftermath is that after a while, these American interventions abroad end, and after a further period elapses, Americans forget that the country is devastated by American interventions, and the citizenry is devastated. I don't or can't or are willing to forget in the same way. And so there was a real focus on aftermath in these works, something that I think was crystallized for all of us working on this project during the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. And at that time, within kind of US media culture, there was this way in which we rehashed and remembered the fall of Saigon, the abrupt US withdrawal that took place in 1975. One of our foremost writers, Viet Thanh Nguyen, wrote a piece called I Can't Forget the Lessons of Vietnam, and Neither Should You. It was a piece that he published in the New York Times. And what that focalized for me was the way that these stories exercise for us a kind of mnemonic function. It's one of the functions they fulfill. They're certainly not stories that are so naive as to believe that we, the Americans or the Anglophone reading and political publics will learn from the past, but they do insist that we don't forget it. That we don't forget the past. In speaking to the other half of your question about this question as to why some of these stories are so unknown or hitherto unknown, it reminded me of the piece that Fiston wrote about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Independent Democratic Republic of the Congo, and an African independence leader, and his piece was about the assassination of Lumumba. But what it's really about is the kind of Lumumba business, to use the title of the story, or the Lumumba industry, which has been propagated in the 60 years since his death. In the way in which stories of his death, of US involvement, of Belgian involvement, have continued to kind of permeate Congolese culture. And part of that is, as Fiston told me privately when we were talking about the story, is that all of the accounts that have been written about Lumumba's death have been written in languages not read by the majority of the population in the DRC. And in any case, the books aren't available there either. And so in place of these historical accounts, these academic accounts, the story investigates the ways in which in popular mythologies, Lumumba lives on, and also his demise, and really violent demise at the hands of the Belgians and the CIA, becomes the stuff of narrative of national mythologies, and can be suppressed by the governments involved in proxy conflicts as took place in the DRC.
Thank you. I was also going to ask the question to you, Bret, that I asked Lina, which was how have these stories been forgotten? How do we not know about these? As I put this book together, I was learning continuously about atrocities. Many of which are not covered in the book, like for instance, Operation Baby Lift in Vietnam was an attempt by the American government to sort of score a PR exercise or a PR win, or kind of salvage some credibility, and they helped to relocate, or they commissioned a number of airplanes to take orphans from Vietnam to pair them with parents in America, and one of the first and most important planes that took off had some kind of malfunction in the takeoff and crashed, and 78 babies were killed in the process. I didn't know about Project 4.1, which was a kind of a covert human testing project after the Marshall Island nuclear bomb testing in the Pacific, studying communities and the way in which humans respond to environmental radiation over many decades. There's so many kind of atrocious stories, and we don't even know about them, half of them. How has how do you think the American administration's got away with those histories not being known?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's one that, in a way, I mean, I think the reader of The American Way is left reflecting on precisely that question, aghast, and also asking herself, how could I not have been aware of these atrocities, especially if that reader is a U.S. citizen or a U.S. translator working the stories. I think the questions you ask, Rob, are especially acute. And in thinking, in thinking about Vietnam or the Congo, just to take the two contributions that I worked on, I mean, another question that comes up is that as time passes, as more time passes, these events exist in the living memory of fewer readers, of fewer Americans. And so the scriptural and sort of mnemonic function of literature becomes even more important. Why do we forget them? How do we forget them? I mean, I think some of them are certainly willfully suppressed because they're not concordant with our view of ourselves. In the introduction to the book, I remember you and Casa Grande were talking about values and the way in which the values, American values of freedom, of spreading democracy, have been used in the near past and also in the farther past to justify our predations abroad. And certainly our values, our ideology also cloud and what we can see. We saw that, I think, to really that the truth of that in Meruane's story, where the mother character, in her interactions with the daughter, the mother's refusal or really inability to see what took place in the Allende, the Pinochet coup, and it's given her an ideological standpoint. She really can't see or avow certain stories. They're not concordant or consistent with her worldview. And this is a book that attempts to disrupt some of those ideological standpoints that have been fundamental to the Pax Americana.
I guess I'm also keen to know what your answer to the second question is, which is this question of the telling of history is a situated knowledge. It's always coming from a position. It's always being told by somebody for a reason and with an agenda. And given the proliferation of different theories and from conspiracy theories to alternate histories, given the kind of rivalry between different narratives that are out there, which is exemplified in Lina's story, in this false story of Plan Zeta, which was the belief that Allende was about to assassinate the middle classes, which was completely false. Given all of these false narratives out there, and the struggles of remembering and preserving actual histories, how is there a sense? Is there some kind of guiding principles that you use yourself to pick through and to kind of divine what is what is the real history? What are real stories? What where the truth is? Do you know how to pick through these conflicting narratives?
That's an excellent question. I think I should mention for viewers who may be less familiar with the History into Fiction series that one of the really interesting things it does is pair writers. Each contribution is paired with a historian who writes an afterword, often in which she's responding to the story and offering a historical explication for that story. And so, I mean, this is, I mentioned that because in thinking of Ra's point now, I mean, it's a question for an historian, and I of course have my opinions, but in my day job, when I'm not wearing my literary translator hat, I'm a literature professor, and of course, as a literature professor, we're more taken by a kind of relativist view of the world. And in that sense, I think speaking as a literature professor and also as a translator involved in the kind of purveying of literature, one thing these stories do, and this anthology does, is offer counter narratives to the kind of dominant hegemonic narratives that the U.S. has been purveying and telling itself for at least the last century. So I think of these accounts as something like counter narratives, and their translation has a large role to play, because unless we want to designate certain individuals, certain Anglophone writers as somehow native informants, writing back and telling the stories of countries with which they may have an ancestral connection, a translation is going to have to play a role in making those sort of multilingual counter narratives legible to the English-speaking readership, and that's something that Common Press does with The American Way.
Thank you both. I think we're going to have to wrap up here. And for those people watching live, there's another event next up. And if you'd like to read the other counter narratives in The American Way, then it's available on the Common Press website, along with the other books in the History into Fiction series. So thank you, Ra, Bret, and Lina. Yeah, everyone's got their copy. Yeah, we'll leave it for now, but thank you for your time.
Good night.
Thanks, Nate.